Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, the author of Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. She has now authored 2 books and edited another, and she's also appeared on this show to discuss each one. Doctor, thank you for batting 1,000.
Well, thank you so much for having me. That's just so kind of you to keep having me back as I put out books.
Yeah, I just looked it up. Episode number 17 and episode 115. It's unbelievable that we're now going to be in the 150s together.
Well, congratulations to you for keeping that going. That is no small thing either.
It is not, but here we are. We're doing it. Before we start the interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And just this week, we gave our annual donation to Reach Out and Read, an organization that makes books a part of the pediatric healthcare process. Doctor, 5 years ago, you'd made a name for yourself on Twitter, and because we both love books and presidents and making history come alive, we became good friends, good buddies. Back then, you told me that you were eager to become a commentator, to write books, and to make a mark on how we all understand the presidency. And you did all of that so well that earlier this month, you became the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. First of all, are you kidding me? And second of all, Doctor, what can your story and your journey teach all of us about journeys?
Well, thank you. I also have the "Are you kidding me" moment sometimes, because I never really anticipated that my career would turn this way. And it was actually a very unexpected opportunity that sort of fell in my lap and was quite fortuitous. So I'm very grateful for it. And especially at this moment in our nation's history and with some really important historical anniversaries coming up, I'm really thrilled about it. One of the things that I think is important about this particular journey is that it was never as I saw it playing out. So I love a plan. I love planning. I'm very type A. I kind of, like to visualize. And there have been a number of twists and turns that I could not have possibly anticipated. And yet they really turned out to be extraordinary things. And so I think maybe the way that I am thinking about it is it's really good to have goals and to work towards those goals and maybe have a short-term plan. But long-term plans have a way of laughing in your face. And my career is certainly a testament to that.
Your first book. Well, before I go to more of the book here, how did you stick with it though? It's so difficult to put yourself out there and to find opportunities and to make yourself available when more opportunities come on. And you wrote pieces and you did TV interviews. And I'm sure you have many moments. I mean, like I guess we all do, where you go, boy, how am I going to keep doing this? This is just so difficult. What was the force behind you that led you to say, I've got to just keep going. This is what I want?
That's a good question. I'm very stubborn. And I'm not afraid of hard work, and I believe in hard work. And so I think, there's that phrase that luck meets preparation plus opportunity. And so I kind of just always hoped that if I could grind it out, like just keep going and just keep working and keep showing up and keep having faith that it would work out, then it would. And I think we all have our various own superpowers of what we're really good at and what we bring to the table. And I don't think that I have ever been, blessed with like the natural highest IQ, but I work really hard. And
No, that's
that ability,
ridiculous.
no, it's true. I mean, like things don't, like I am not, something does not come always supernaturally to me. But I am willing to grind it out. And my ability to grind is, I think, what I bring to the table. And so I just kept at it and hoped that if I kept grinding, then maybe I would outlast competition and I would just make it happen.
All right. Your first book was indeed about George Washington. It was a masterful examination of how he constructed his cabinet, how he used his cabinet, and how he forged yet another precedent. There's that word for how the presidency would operate. How does a presidential scholar, how did you move past your first big project for which you essentially have your entire life to prepare for, and seize on project number two, which is John Adams, and to say, this is something I need to bone up on and churn out? What, sort of recreates that drive in you to say, now I've got to find topic number two?
Well, I think everyone kind of comes to it differently. Some people come up with a question that motivates them. Some people find a character as they're sort of pursuing their first book or something, and this character is maybe a side little person in the first story, but looks like might be a really great story for book number two. For me, I came at book two initially thinking that it was going to be sort of almost like continuation of the cabinet story of, you have Washington creates the president's cabinet and then what happens afterwards. And he's immediately followed by two very different examples. And one was John Adams and one was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson had one of the best cabinets in US history. He had almost no turnover. They were really effective. John Adams did not. His cabinet was kind of a disaster in a lot of ways, at least until the very end. And so I wanted to understand, like, what did that process look like? Why did it unfold in that way? What was it about their two administrations or those two men that created these dynamics? And that was initially my intention. And then two things happened. One, I started writing and I realized I didn't want to write a book about Jefferson. And so I cut off that half of the book. And partially that was because I had written a scholarly article in a journal about Jefferson's cabinet, and I kind of realized that I had said all I had to say, and I didn't really have that much else that I wanted to flesh out. And the second piece is that I have to be compelled in some way by the person that I'm spending 4 years with. And for whatever reason, I believe Jefferson is insanely important, but I didn't want to spend 4 years with him. So cut off the Jefferson piece. So then I was left with the Adams piece. And then January 6th happened. And I started looking at presidential transitions in a very different way because I realized how much intention and care and how many small actions by so many people are required to actually make them work. And I wondered with those early transitions how much care and intention had gone into crafting them. And it turns out a great deal. And so that really shaped the book. So in a lot of ways, it's a product of what I had seen in my own life.
Yeah, it's crazy because so much of the transition, at least for people of our generation, and I guess most American generations, depends on the people doing the transitioning to sort of obey these unwritten rules and guidelines that are just sort of handed down. Transitions are not necessarily baked into the Constitution. Much has been made of George Washington's decision to give up power, to not run again. There are honestly entire libraries on it, and I've got probably an entire library on that here. When and how did you realize that the real precedent in terms of the transition between Washington and Adams had to be conceived of and set by John Adams as opposed to the commonly thought of George Washington, and how it sort of surrounded this person to whom power was being transferred to by the Electoral College as opposed to transferred from?
Yeah, so I don't know that I would say it was like 100% John Adams. I do think, Washington's biggest choice is the decision to make sure the transition happens while he's alive and in a very intentional way, as opposed to him dying and they're needing like power going to someone and then there needing to be an election. So he wanted it to be planned, and I think that was really essential. But as we've seen with the last several transitions, it really takes two to tango. And each person has a huge role in shaping what the character of that transition looks like and how it goes and what is presented to the American people. And so it wasn't just that Washington was giving up power, it was that Adams was taking it on. And no one else had ever had that type of power before other than Washington. And he was such a unique character in American history because he was so well respected, even by 1797. And really revered as the father of the country. And so there were these real questions of, does the presidency work for anyone else? which kind of sounds ridiculous to us because, like, we know how it has unfolded, and indeed other people can be in the office, but they didn't know that. And so there were these real questions about, like, can the country work? Can the institutions work without Washington? Can we hold together without his unifying presence? Will foreign nations respect our decisions without he being the one making them? And John Adams was tasked with taking on those fears and trying to reassure the American people and craft precedent for everyone who would come after that would have, mere mortal status, just like he did. And really, in some ways, Washington did not.
Yeah. When we discussed the cabinet, I asked you to take us into the cabinet room, and you did, of course, masterfully. Today, take us into the White House the day John Adams walked into it. And I think it's important to remember that the White House, as we perceive it, is not what it was back then. There was no West Wing or East Wing. So explain when John Adams walked in, the oh, damn it moment that he had when he walked in there as president for the first time.
Yeah. So John Adams spent the first 3 years of his presidency in the president's house in Philadelphia, which was the same place that Washington had spent a significant portion of his presidential tenure. Then the federal government moved to Washington, D.C., and it was the capital city. And it was really the first capital city because Philadelphia had its own state government and there were a lot of other things happening. So in the summer of 1800, the government moves down, they ship all their papers. There's all of this work to try and make that happen. And Adams went in June to initially make sure everything was set up. And then he came back in November for the first time and spent the first night that a president spent in the White House on November 1st, 1800. The White House, if you look at the White House, like from Pennsylvania Avenue, you can't really see the West and East. You can't really see the West Wing at this point and like the side buildings. It's just the main building. And that building really from the outside looked pretty similar to how it would look today, at least in terms of size and scale and composition. It was enormous. It was by far the biggest building in Washington, D.C. by a long shot. The grounds had not been finished, and it was still technically a construction site because they were trying to finish up some additional pieces. So imagine walking on to, it was muddy, it was winter. There were still both enslaved and free workers making bricks and digging in these holes and, sawing wood and lumber and carving stone. Once he walked into the house, some of it was still unfinished. The East Room, which is the largest room where sometimes they hold really big events, that was an unfinished space. And as a side note, once Abigail joined him, she hung their laundry there to dry because it was the only place that had some privacy that was also big enough to hang laundry. She couldn't hang it outside because there were no fences. And so everyone walking by would have been able to see their laundry.
That is
But
not a pretty sight. No
yeah, so
offense
she
to
was
them.
hanging their she was hanging their laundry in the East Room. They had to have fires going continuously because the paint and the plaster was still wet. So they had fires going all the time to try and get it to dry. There were leaks in the roof, so they had these buckets placed to try and catch the leaks. There was not a White House staff like we think of today, and so each president was responsible for bringing their own workers. And so many brought enslaved workers. The Adams did not own any individuals. And so they hired people from local families or hired free workers as well. And so it was a matter of like trying to figure out how you could get enough people in the house to keep the fires going. And they couldn't find firewood. There were forests everywhere, but they couldn't hire someone to chop the wood. I mean, it was kind of a preposterous situation.
Get out there, Mr. President. Grab your axe. Um, what maybe my first scene of the book when I read it the first time through, and I will say I was an advanced reader of this book, which was an enormous honor for me. But my favorite scene of the book, maybe my favorite one, is the actual, and I should have asked this question first. I'm not sure why I didn't. We kind of were jumping around here, but the actual transfer of power is awesome. The inauguration of John Adams. Can you describe what we would have seen, and importantly for today's reader as well, where we would have seen it? Because the transition is not as it appears on TV today in the year 2024, or in our generation here, on the steps of the Capitol building.
Yeah, absolutely. So the transition took place at Congress Hall in Philadelphia, which still exists, still stands today. You can go visit it. The ceremony was held on the first floor, which was the House of Representatives chamber. It was the largest chamber in the building. The dignitaries would have come first, so Supreme Court justices, cabinet secretaries, um, diplomats that were visiting from out of town, elite families. The representatives and senators were all seated in the chamber, and then there were additional seats sort of added behind and up in the bleachers for people to come and watch. It was apparently not even standing room only, totally squished. There was no space left. Outside, thousands and thousands of people had gathered to observe the ceremonies, to see who was present. Jefferson arrived first because he had to go upstairs to the Senate chambers to take his oath as vice president. George Washington arrived second. There was a huge uproar when he arrived because people didn't know if there was no expectation that he would be there. There was no precedent that he would be there. There was no precedent at the state level that the outgoing person stayed for the incoming person. And so it was a huge shock, but also sort of like a celebration that he was there. And then John Adams arrived in his carriage, and he was also greeted with huge cheers. He went inside and he would have walked down. There was a central aisle down the center of the chamber. There was a sort of a raised dais at the front where the Speaker of the House would typically sit. And he greeted Washington and Jefferson and the Supreme Court justices. He then gave his address. So the order in which they did things was different than we do it today. He gave his address. He took the oath of office. And again, huge cheers. And then on his way out, he went first and Washington walked behind him. And that was pretty remarkable because Washington probably hadn't walked behind anyone else in maybe 2 decades
Right.
because of
Right.
because of his
Right.
stature.
I'm
So it's like
first.
this, yeah. But what I love about the moment was the people in the room. We know that the election of 1800 was quite contentious, and that is considered now today to be one of the like big first peaceful transfers of power. They didn't know that was coming. This is all they knew. And they were living in the world of the French Revolution, where transitions could often be very bloody and characterized by guillotines. And so they talked about this as though they said it was the most sublime thing in human history, and that everyone present had tears streaming down their face, which sounds kind of hyperbolic to us, but it demonstrates the tension of the moment, the stakes of the moment, and how rare they understood this to be in human history, that people willingly went away and then assumed power peacefully.
Uh, what a scene that must have been. Did John Adams say anything in his inaugural address that addressed the idea that they were transferring power?
Yes, he did. So he talked about the importance of Washington's precedents, and he acknowledged that Washington had really set the nation on a path that had made it stronger, had made it better, had crystallize the Constitution into practices that they were living with. And he expressed his gratitude that Washington's continuing existence would be a bulwark against threats to liberty. And so he didn't, use the word transfer or transition, but he did acknowledge that this was a very rare moment and that Washington was still going to be there, and that was something that didn't happen all that often.
Explain the country to us at this time. What is going on in the United States right now? You allude to the fact that the country was not, although they had faith in their president, meaning Washington, that there were things that seemed uneasy and a bit out of control. Explain America in 1797 in the short time frame that we have here.
Yeah, so there were a lot of things that felt very unstable. The country had really only been in existence for about 20 years, and the first 10-ish of those were during the war. The first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, had failed. So they were on their second chance, which most republics did not get. And that was an extraordinary moment. But there was a sense that they weren't sure that it was going to work because there were starting to be these huge partisan divisions. There were the two first baby political parties, not parties like we have today, but certainly emerging into that. There was a lot of disagreement about foreign policy and domestic policy, and they weren't sure that the Constitution would work under those pressures. There was a war raging in Europe between France and Great Britain and all of their various allies. The US was sort of constantly getting dragged into some of those skirmishes. The European empires were very eager to pick off any states that wanted to leave the Union or to cause problems on the Western borders. And they constantly had pandemics in the summer. Yellow fever would sort of reoccur regularly. The threat of political violence was real and tangible. And so it is not a golden year that we should think back of it was better when. They very much did not see it that way. They were very convinced at any given moment that everything could fall apart and were prepared to try and combat any threat that they saw to the future of the nation.
Give us a bit of a primer here on John Adams. He was in an enormous predicament here. He had an enormously tough act to follow, the toughest act. Why is it like a baseball player trying to duplicate Willie Mays, RIP, to him? Explain, this sort of nebbishy, unlikable guy, at least is portrayed by Mr. Feeney in 1776 in the movie. What do we need to know about his career and how his life led him to this moment of being the second president?
John Adams was probably one of the best prepared people that ever became president in some ways. So he had served in Congress, he was a lawyer, he had served as a diplomat to many of the major courts in Europe, which was a real centerpiece of presidential authority, foreign policy, and diplomacy. He had written the Massachusetts state constitution, which was one of the main models for the US Constitution. He was a brilliant political thinker. He was clearly devoted to the patriot cause. He benefited from the extraordinary wisdom of his very brilliant wife, who, Abigail Adams, one of my favorite pieces of this book was realizing that it wasn't just, one letter that was quite amazing of Remember the Ladies. It was that every letter was just full of insight and wisdom and snark, and she could see exactly what was happening and was such a savvy observer of political activity. And he knew it, and so he cherished her, and she was really his cabinet of one, as some of his critics said, which it was actually a fair criticism. One of the things that I think made Adams so well prepared for this moment was he occasionally relished being unpopular if he felt he was doing the right thing. He could be very stubborn in that way and kind of took like a perverse sense of pleasure in irking people if he felt like he was doing the moral and right thing. And that had started with when he agreed to defend or to represent the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre. And so he demonstrated sort of this long trend of being willing to tweak people if he felt like it was the right thing to do. And that stubbornness, that willingness to do the right thing was essential in this moment. Because as you said, anyone who came after Washington was going to have a terrible time. And Adams knew it. He was not unaware of the difference in their stature. And yet he did it anyway. And I think that shows tremendous political courage. And that political courage comes back again and again in his presidency. The one thing he was missing, the one thing that I think really shaped much of his presidency, is I listed all of those various positions. None of them were executive. So he had never been a governor. He had not been an officer in the war and managed other men. And critically, Washington never invited him to a single cabinet meeting. So he had never seen what it looked like to manage the cabinet. He had never managed in an executive capacity. And I do think that really hindered his ability at times as president.
I want to get back to our plot here in a couple of minutes here, but I have a few questions about the creation of this book. I was an advanced reader of the book, which was super cool. First time I've ever been asked to do something like that. And I'm not a scholar or a historian, and I don't pretend to be. But you asked me to read the book with the eye of someone who hosts A, this show, and then B, who has read hundreds and hundreds of general audience history books, and to make suggestions that would make the book so slightly more appealing to readers like me. And to be clear, it didn't need any help. But in general, how many readers look at a book and make suggestions before you actually send it off to an editor and or publisher?
Well, I think it totally depends on the writer. So I tend to like to share my work early and often. I think it makes me better. I think it helps me prevent future mistakes. It confirms my own ability to assess my work. Not everyone is like that. A lot of people like to write a full draft and then share it with people. I would That would really lengthen my process because sharing work early and often prevents me from going down bad paths. So I have two writing groups that read specific chapters at various times and gave feedback on those chapters, which much was incorporated into this book. I asked you to read it, and it was extraordinarily helpful because, to your point, this book isn't really for historians. I mean, I hope that they take something from it, but I wanted it to reach people who don't have a PhD, who are not in the academy. I wanted it to be a good story, to have flow, to be compelling to that type of reader. So it was essential to me that that was the case. My editor, of course, read it a couple of times at various stages. I did have a manuscript workshop where I shared about 80% of it with a group of scholars, and they gave feedback, which is an extraordinary privilege. A lot of people don't have that opportunity. I always have my mom read my books because, like you, she really likes history, but is not a professional historian. And so I want that perspective. And then when I'm almost done, I usually have my husband read the beginning and the end to make sure the argument is clear because he's a lawyer and he prioritizes clarity above all else. And so I want it to be clear and punchy. And then my dog Quincy had to listen to me read it out loud twice.
You read it out loud twice.
I did. So, as part of my copy editing process, I read it out loud to make sure I wasn't missing anything.
Uh,
And I did the same thing again with page proofs, both because I felt like it was the most effective way to catch anything, but I also will be recording the audiobook myself. And so
oh,
I felt like it would be really good practice.
that's awesome. This is a 340 page book, but I read a 480 page book. What happened to the other pages? They weren't that bad. What happened to the other pages? And then how hard are
So,
they to part with?
yeah, so you read it in Word. And the document you're looking at now is the page proofs, what it actually looks like in the book. And that's a really great way to explain why people say, "How many pages is your book?" And I say, that's the wrong question to ask. You want to
Uh,
ask, how many words is it?
so what is the
Because
difference in words?
um, I really actually didn't cut
Oh,
out that
okay.
much
Okay.
because I ended
All right.
up cutting a bunch and then adding more, which is always the challenge. For context, people should know that this book is, if you've read The Cabinet, the Cabinet, including notes, was 110,000 words. This, I think, is 135,000 words.
Oh.
So it is longer, but not like twice the size.
Yeah. And is it going to be forgive the pejoratives here. They're not pejoratives, I guess, but is it going to be a short, stumpy book like The Cabinet, or is it going to be
I,
like the
n-
standard 9 by
yeah,
6?
No, it's going to be a little taller. So the cabinet was through the Belknap imprint of Harvard, and they do the short stumpy, which I actually love. I feel like it's easier to hold, but Oxford doesn't do that size. So the Oxford trade line is publishing this book, and so it will probably be a more standard book size.
Nine by
So it will
six. Yeah.
be, yeah. So
Yeah.
it won't be, it probably won't be as thick as the cabinet, but it is actually longer.
Cool. Do other historians, when they look at these books, and I read some of the names in the acknowledgments, do other historians look at these books and say, whoa, what is Lindsay thinking here historically here? And then do you revise, or are you the historian and are they just giving different types of feedback?
Um, I think that they give lots of different types of feedback. It also depends who I'm talking to and at what point they're looking at the book. So, my writing groups are reading it early, and one of the goals of that is, like, if I'm getting something very wrong, I want them to tell me. And it's a way of sort of fact checking yourself without actually having someone go through and fact check it, because a lot of the people who are reading it are very familiar with early American history. So if I'm missing a major event, if I'm getting an interpretation very wrong, they will tell me. They will also tell me if the argument I'm making is not compelling or doesn't stand up or isn't clear. As we get later on, it does tend to be more stylistic about here's how you could make that argument slightly more in a slightly more compelling fashion, or I think you should say it this way, or this needs to come out a little bit more, things like that. And it also just depends on the person's style preference and also like how they like to give feedback. I have some people who tend to be more positive and some people who tend to be not negative, but constructive. But I think it's really good to have a balance of those things, which is why I do like to share it with a lot of different people.
How do you battle the obstacle as a historian of making a world come alive that didn't have electricity or clean water, or and a lot of other things to an American consumer today that has phones and Zoom and air conditioning and planes to go further than, in 1 hour than most people went in a lifetime in the 1790s? How do you battle that, knowing that you're talking to an audience that can't even fathom life in the 1790s?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm always tempted to include more details of like what the physical world was. But that was one of the things where, like occasionally my editor would be like, you're not writing an architectural piece, Lindsay. Like, we don't actually need to know every single bit. I'm like, but it's so interesting. And she's like, I'm not sure everyone will agree. Um, I think the key is to balance giving enough information to demonstrate that in some ways this is a totally foreign world. And, they are in carriages. They are not in cars. They do not have electricity. They are dealing with writing things by candlelight. And yet also emphasizing the things that are sort of universal and constant about the human experience. Missing people that you love that are away from you, fears of failing, fear that you won't, live up to expectations, anger, grudges. These are, human emotions that exist across time. And so I think if you can bring out both of those things. Like, for example, at one moment, John Adams has a terrible cold, like just horrible cold, and he is stuck in bed and he had been traveling for days and he finally gets to his place and all he wants to do is collapse in bed. That is a very human, like we've all been there. So I think if you can balance those things, it helps it feel both accessible while also not allowing us to forget that this is in some ways a very different world.
So what is going to happen now between now and the book's release, which by the way is September 5th? And Lindsay is offering a number of perks if you order copies from her website. So check that out. But what is your plan now? You have a PR campaign to mount and you want to hit certain goals with how many copies this thing sells. So how is this all going to work for you? What is the map that you have laid out that gets you to what is called in the industry Pub Day, September 5th?
Yes. Yes. So, for a lot of people who are not in the book industry, this can feel very opaque, and in some ways, that is intentionally so. The way that the publication business works is books that do really well in their first week, and that includes like pre-orders technically count as day one sales. So, all pre-orders plus your first week determine basically how much attention the book gets from media, from whether or not bookstores buy it, how long they keep it on their shelves, who pays attention to it, whether or not the press is going to continue to put money behind boosting it, things like that. So the publication process actually starts and the publicity process starts way in advance because you have to start churning up that engine to try and get pre-orders going, to get people aware that it's coming, to get events booked. So like I have an events calendar that's pretty much booked up through finalizing February right now of 2025. So all of these things get booked way in advance. I have pieces that are written, that are scheduled, that are ready to go. I have podcasts booked. Then there are, like some of the outreach, more things like TV and radio tends to come a little bit closer. So that outreach will take place between 6 weeks up through pub date. Hopefully it makes a big splash and then a little bit more media will come along. But it is a very lengthy process. And in some ways, pub date is sort of like the 2/3 mark through the process. And then you're hoping that it does continue from there. One of the reasons I'm doing this campaign, and you can go to my website, or it's lindsaychervinsky.pub/signed copies, is where you can get a 30% off discount. I'm doing this campaign with Porchlight, which is this great company that allows me to have these individually designed. I designed an Adams themed book plate. I like to make themed book plates for each of my books. So this is an Adams themed book plate. I'll be able to sign all of them. It allows me to get signed copies to people who can't come to events. They do get an early discount because they pre-order it. And if you want to buy more than one, there's some like extra goodies that go along with it. And ideas for if you do want to buy more than one, what do you want to do with those extra copies, of course. But the reason that not to get too much into the weeds, and if this is too much into the weeds, tell me, but to get on lists, like bestseller lists that everyone is, secretly or not so secretly gunning for.
Not that secretly. It's
It
not that
has to
secret.
be it has to be reported. Those sales have to be reported. And so what Porchlight does is it reports, because it basically reports through bookstores, which are bookstores that funnel into those lists. Whereas if you buy from, let's say you buy from the press, sometimes the press doesn't report to the lists, which seems weird, but as I said, it's a very opaque process. And if you look at those lists, sometimes you'll see what looks like a little cross mark. And it's basically saying this was a bulk buy. The listing was made by bulk buy. So for example, the RNC tends to bulk buy books written by Fox producers or Fox media hosts, because they want publishers to continue to publish those books. So next time you look at the New York Times list, look for those little crosses. And Porchlight helps you get around the cross situation.
Are you hoping that this year being a presidential election year, that there will be more attention?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think people understand. Well, that's certainly my hope. My hope is that
Yeah.
people understand the stakes of the election and understand the stakes of the peaceful transfer of power and why that matters and why it does require participation and buy-in from so many people. And hopefully this story will contribute to an understanding of how that was created and why it continues to require so much attention and care by everyone involved.
All right, back to our plot here. You say there are critical contributions that Adams made. He defended, you say, executive authority by defying the loudest voices in his party, by reasserting control over the military and foreign policy. How?
It's a great question. Big question. So Adams was battling a big division within the Federalist Party, which is what he was technically a member of. There was a faction of it called the Arch Federalists, and they were much more radical, much more extreme. And many members of his cabinet were members of the Arch Federalists. And they were particularly close with Alexander Hamilton, who was not in the cabinet, but who was a figurehead and a leader and really spearheaded a lot of these efforts. As a threat of war with France emerged, Congress had created additional armed forces to combat that potential threat. And basically Adams' cabinet forced him into appointing Alexander Hamilton as number 2 in the army. Washington was number 1, but he was going to stay at home in Mount Vernon unless there was an invasion. And so whoever was number 2, they were going to have all the power. And Adams was sort of boxed into appointing Hamilton as number 2, which he was very uncomfortable with because he really didn't trust Hamilton. So what Adams ended up doing is he, over time, slowly moved towards diplomacy. He ultimately sent a peace commission to France, which secured the Treaty of Mortefontaine, which was signed in October of 1800. And to this day, the United States and France are one of the longest peaceful allies because of that treaty. So we have not been at war with France since then. That treaty was really essential to the nation's security and safety because war would have been extraordinarily damaging, if not fatal. But by asserting himself over that process, by sending the peace commission, and by ultimately successfully achieving a treaty, it reinforced the president's authority to send those types of commissions, to be in charge of foreign policy. It also undermined the army, which had become a very dangerous, very political force. We typically, don't want to undermine our army, but at that point, the army was very political and it was very involved in election shenanigans in a way that we would be extremely uncomfortable with in the 21st century. And Adams was extremely uncomfortable with it. So he undermined the army. And then towards the end of his presidency, he removed the most nefarious forces from his cabinet. And in doing so, really established the precedent, which had sort of been real, but it had been very theoretical, that the president has full control over removal from the cabinet. And by doing so, he made that precedent real in a tangible way.
How did he battle the threat of war in the minds of the public? The public is obviously fixated on this possibility. The newspapers are talking all about it. How did he go on a PR campaign here to allay the concerns of a nation that certainly north to south was, just about what it is today, although of course the east west it's not. So explain in that day and age how a president could go out without radio, without TV, and make a case far and wide.
So this is an area where I think Adams certainly could have done more. He was not always the loudest. He did not, the concept of like a bully pulpit was not really fully defined yet. And I think he probably could have explored the potential there a little bit more. Early on, when there was a threat of war, and he and Congress took action to prepare the country in the event that there would be war. They created a navy for the first time. They had a naval department. These are excellent things if you need to defend the nation. They boosted out coastal defenses and created additional army regiments. And a lot of the American people sent these addresses to Adams. And really, the addresses came from a wide subsection of the American people. So north to south, east to west, all types, whether it was student groups to, sort of elite universities to congregations and cities to workers. They sent him addresses thanking him for his, firm stance on behalf of the nation's honor and expressing their support. And he wrote back to every single one. And he wrote back to every single one in a unique way. There was no standard letter, which, he signed, which took an enormous amount of time if you have to think about the fact that he was doing this with parchment and quill. So he wrote back to every single one with an original note to express his confidence in the American people, to express his desire that, they survive. And it was the best way that he could speak to them because he knew that those addresses would then not only be shared within the group, but they would often be published in the local newspapers. And so would get, as broad of a reach as possible. Later on in his presidency, when he was really pushing for diplomacy and wanted to make sure that peace would work, he used his trips from Quincy, Massachusetts, where he lived, to Washington, D.C., and back again as opportunities to meet with as many Americans as possible. He couldn't technically campaign at that point because that was considered a big no-no under political culture at the time, but he could host, he could attend a celebration that was held in his honor as the visiting president and give an address about the importance of diplomacy and securing peace and the future of the nation. So he used everything at his disposal. But I do think there are times when he probably could have been a louder voice.
When you read historical accounts of the Adams presidency today, and you look at the lists of where historians rank the presidents of their effectiveness, John Adams comes in, at least in the second half. He comes in, sometimes, not quite near the bottom because there are a lot of bottom feeders on that list these days. But, do you think that is fair? Do you think it is fair to consider John Adams a failed, or let's just say even a weak president?
No, I don't. So I think there are a couple pieces there. One, we have a really bad habit of thinking one-term presidents are failed presidents because just because they lost an election does not mean they were failed. So a great example of this is George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush was essential in ensuring that the end of the Cold War was done peacefully and didn't turn into a nuclear catastrophe. That is not a failure by any stretch of the imagination. And I think Adams was not a failed president either. He exhibited restraint at a lot of key moments, and restraint is very hard to quantify. It's way less sexy than winning a civil war, or a World War II or something like that. So, it's much harder to give credit for that. He did secure peace at a time when foreign policy really was dominating nations' politics. So I think he deserves way more credit for that. And then he demonstrated political courage at a time when that was really hard to do. And he put the Constitution above his own political interests time and time and time again. And so, for that civic virtue, I think he deserves just so much gratitude. And lastly, he lost and he went home. And he was the first president to lose and go home. And so, at a time of Napoleon, at a time of military dictatorships, that was a radical act and should be appreciated as such.
As yeah, I guess right, because George Washington didn't lose. He just decided to give up power. It was different to give up power if you'd actually lost. And it was a close election too, so he probably could have made a case of, I don't want to say the word, but rigged or whatever else. I want to ask, um, when it comes to a tactical mistake that he made in his presidency that has sort of led to historians thinking this guy just didn't quite have the executive chops. What do you think that is, and why do you think the analysis of that may be a bit off?
So there are two mistakes that he made. One, I think he knew they were both mistakes in the long term. So the first was, while he did not advocate for the Alien and Sedition Acts, he did sign them. And under the Alien and Sedition Acts, he had the authority to deport any suggested enemies. He did not choose to do so. So he did not in any way enforce the Alien Acts, which is, I think, a point in his credit. He did approve prosecutions under the Sedition Act, and that's just a mark against his administration. It's a mark against Congress. It's especially a mark against Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, who oversaw those prosecutions. The second mistake was that he was gone for most of the year in 1799 when a number of things were happening. He spent most of the year in Quincy mostly because I think Abigail was quite sick and he really didn't want to leave her side. However, I also think that he used his absence as strategic delay and as a way to undermine the army, to undermine its formation, to make it harder for them to get things done. So, in some ways, I do think it was slightly intentional, but it definitely was a mark on people's thoughts about his presence as president. And that gets at why I think we view him the way we do. And that's because he was faced with two extraordinary propagandists. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were both writing about John Adams while they were living at the same time. So they saw him being absent and talked about it. And they both disliked him for their own personal reasons and political reasons and sought to bring him down. And often times historians have read their descriptions of Adams written contemporaneously as fact, as truth, as, like this hard historical observation, as opposed to a very political observation, which doesn't mean there's not, some truth in it, but it should be viewed through the lens of partisan animus. And so I just think that in a lot of ways, historians have allowed Hamilton and Jefferson to tell the story. And I get it. They were really good at what they did, but they are often not treated as gospel in other things, and yet they are treated in gospel in this.
This is a family thing. The only two presidents to not win re-election among the first seven presidents, or maybe it's eight. Did Van Buren have two terms? I forget already.
No, he had one.
So he had one. So the only two of the first seven to not win re-election were Adams's father and son. Is there a family thing there? Were they just too darn righteous to understand politics?
That's a great question. I think Adam Sr., John Adams, had a better understanding of politics, and I think that he had a better chance of winning. We should also keep in mind that if not for the three-fifths clause, he would have won. So Southern states received a significant boost in their representation in Congress and their representation in the Electoral College, and they tended to vote for Democratic Republicans. So
I hadn't
that's
heard
worth noting.
I hadn't heard that before. If we were on one of those shows where you get points for things, I would have given points there. Very interesting. All right. Go
I
ahead.
should just say, like, John Quincy Adams was never going to win re-election because the politics of the time were shifting so much and the parties were shifting so much that I just don't think he stood a chance.
America is getting ready now for another transfer of power. We hope it will be peaceful. The last one was not. What do we need to take away from the George Washington, John Adams transfer of power that is particularly applicable to the confines of American politics today?
I think this is true of both the George Washington to John Adams and John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, which is how the book closes. What makes those transitions possible is not acts of military heroism or insane levels of genius like Albert Einstein. It's a lot of people whose names most of us don't remember acting in accordance with the Constitution and putting the survival of the Constitution and the Republic above their own personal or political interests, which is what I define as civic virtue. And that is so essential in a republic or in a democracy because most of our laws depend on the honor system. They depend on goodwill. They depend on citizens upholding them and ensuring that they run smoothly. And that is especially true for the transfer of power because so much of that process is not written down and it's not codified. That's changing a little bit, but much of it is still norm and custom. And that requires all of us, as well as all of the participants on Capitol Hill, to adhere to that norm and custom.
I do want to amend what I said. We don't know if there will be a transfer of power at all this January. I guess I should have said either transfer of power or election, because we of course don't know who's going to win this election. John Adams would have said January 6th was blank.
A travesty.
Okay. Next. Next question. Uh, uh, if you could design a John Adams memorial, what would that look like?
So there is actually an effort that has been long underway. There's now a commission in Congress to create an Adams Family Memorial. And I like that idea because I do think that so much of what John Adams had to offer was really a family commitment to service, to small r republicanism, to a commitment to the Constitution, and just a real driving sense of patriotism, of loyalty to the nation above all else. And that was, as I said, it was very much a family project. So I don't know exactly what it would look like. I'm actually not very creative in terms of like visual arts, but I would like to see something that reflected those values, that reflected lengthy political service. And, John Quincy Adams is a great example of this. He loses as president and then goes back into the House and has this second career, third career, fifth career, or however you want to count it. This extraordinary post-presidential career as an amazing congressman and a outspoken opponent of slavery. And so he could have gone home and instead he decided to continue to serve. So I would love to see that reflected.
You're a great baseball fan, Lindsay. What would John Adams have thought of baseball?
Oh, I think he would have loved it. I think he would have loved that it was called, like America's pastime, because as I said, the patriotism. I think that he would have liked the brainier aspects about it, especially as we've gotten increasingly technical. And I think he would have really gotten into that. And he was never one for a whole lot of violence. He was just not a particularly violent person. So I think that I'm not sure football would have been as
Throw out
appealing to
hockey,
him.
throw out football. Too much.
Yeah, not that he was like opposed to it. He wasn't like a pacifist, but he wasn't a brawler in the same way like Hamilton would be all about hockey. I think he'd be like, cheering to throw him against the boards. Whereas I think Adams would like the brainier aspects of baseball.
You're not only Dr. Chervinsky, you're Director Chervinsky now. What are your goals for the GW library? Where is it now, and where do you think it needs to go?
So the library's only been around for about 10 years, which is amazing because it has established, I think, a really good track record of supporting scholarship and great public events and really building out its collections. I would like to continue to do all of those things. But building on that foundation, I would really like the library to be a public forum that brings together the DC community, whether that's historians, visitors, think tanks, people that work in policy, government journalists. I'd like to bring everyone together to have the big conversations that I don't think Washington would have been afraid of. And What's unique about Washington is he's not claimed by a party. Because he was first, he sort of stands aside from everyone else. And that is an opportunity I want to make the most of. I
Mm.
want
Yeah,
so many every president since Washington has basically thought about him and has referred back to him. So it is an opportunity, I think, to think about the presidency and the nation broadly in a way that he would want us to do, because he wanted Americans to come together, talk about big things, but be reminded that they had more in common than they had different. And he wanted a university for that purpose, but I think he would be okay with the library too.
yeah, that's so interesting. I would do more points for that because uh, Republicans today have Lincoln Day dinners, Democrats have Jackson Day dinners.
Although
But
that's now called the
yeah,
Liberty
that's
and
not that
Freedom Dinner.
anymore. What is it called now?
I think it's like Liberty and Freedom or
Yeah.
Liberty and Justice or
I,
something. It was the JJ dinner for a long time. It's
I
not
get
that
why
anymore.
I get it. I get why they went in that direction. But George Washington doesn't have that. No one, you're right. No one says that's our guy. Interesting point. The dedication is to your parents. And the dedication says, who taught me how to work hard and insisted with unflinching conviction that there was nothing I couldn't achieve if I set my mind to it. Why did you want to make sure that you put that in print for them to see?
When I was spending 4 years in the Adams papers, I was often struck by Adams' sense, really the entire family's sense of they had a real awareness of their own weaknesses, their own deficiencies, their own fallibilities, but wanted to do better, wanted to work hard to fix them. I mean, the sense of hard work. One of John Adams' favorite compliments was a newspaper called him an old fielder, which was a type of horse that didn't require a lot of food and a lot of attention, but just worked really hard all the time, and he loved that. And so in some ways that like family ethos of hard work and commitment was one that I recognized. And the Adamses were, founding parents or whatever, but they were also parents in their own home, and that was such a huge part of their identity. And so it felt really natural to me as I was reading these letters that felt, in some ways they're distant, they're using different language, but also felt so familiar that I wanted to honor that with my parents. And they have done, so much to make my career possible. They were so supportive of education and everything that it was really important for me to acknowledge that.
Your dog is named after John Quincy Adams, and in fact, his name is, and I just learned this. His dog is John Quincy. His name is John Quincy Dog Adams. Does that mean John Quincy Adams is your next project? And do you want to give any more hints as to what is coming next?
It might be. I have not. So the genuine answer is that I'm tossing around a couple of different books. Um, I genuinely don't know which one is going to be next. I think one might have more impact long term, but is a much harder book to write. And I'm not sure it's a great idea to take on a very hard book as I'm starting a very big job. The other one, which would be the John Quincy Adams one, it wouldn't just be him. It would be sort of a cast situation, um, would be easier. So, and I also, part of me feels like I really need to write the John Quincy Adams book while John Quincy Dog Adams is alive. He's 10. So part of me feels like maybe do that and I can include him in my author photo, which is not how you should decide book topics, but nonetheless, it has crossed my mind. So stay tuned. I'm still kind of trying to figure it out. I hate it when people give those answers on podcasts, and I always wanted to have a firm answer, but life has again thrown me a loop, and my very firm plan is a little bit up in the air at the moment.
Well understood. Lindsay Chervinsky, the author of Making the Presidency, John Adams, and the Precedents that Forged the Republic. Thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me.
Check out the book and her website, lindsaychervinsky.com. She does also a great Substack and is active on the website formerly known as Twitter at LM I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to axelbank.com. Sorry, what am I saying? Go to patreon.com/axelbankhistory. I've only done that 10,000 times. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We will update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.